there.
Hi.
We are the
Dyslexia Duo.
Each week, we sit down with amazing people, including top researchers and experts in dyslexia, powerful advocates, affected individuals, and more.
Together, we break down the myths, share real stories, highlight research and strategies to advise our listeners about this prevalent learning disability.
Come join us. Okay, so welcome to the Dyslexia Duo. This is Aimee Rodenroth and
Melissa Dean.
And today we have a very, very special guest. We have the fabulous Dr. Nancy Mather, who agreed to talk on our show today. So I'm going to let Dr. Mather pick it up and just kind of tell our audience, because we have a very wide audience. We have an audience of parents. We have an audience of teachers. We have an audience of people who have been working with dyslexia for a while in the field. So go ahead and introduce yourselves to our listeners.
Okay, great. Hi, I'm Nancy Mather. I live in Tucson, Arizona, where it's been a very hot summer, but I think that's probably true everywhere, that we've had a pretty hot summer. So I was a professor at the University of Arizona here in Tucson. I'm now a professor emerita, which means you're retired, but I have to tell you it's rather a fake retirement. But anyway, and so just in terms of a little bit of what got me interested in dyslexia, I got a master's in behavior disorders. And so my first job was in a middle school in a self-contained class with kids who'd been classified at that time as having behavior disorders. And one of the things, I quickly realized was a lot of these kids, their problems are really stemming from the fact that they can't read, that their reading is so low that they're really not fitting into school or doing well in their classes, and they're angry and they're upset. And that a lot of the behavior really stemmed from the fact they were struggling so much in school. And so it just made me start thinking about, we really need to get to children early before they get to middle school, and still can't read. We need to get these kids in kindergarten and first and second grade and not let them get to middle school, with such poor reading. So that sort of, started me on my path. And then I went and got a doctorate under Dr. Samuel Kirk. I don't know if any of you remember him,
yeah.
But, he was the father of the field of learning disabilities, supposedly. And so
Wow.
Did a doctorate, with him, which was, a really wonderful experience. And so, since that time, I've been busy doing some research and writing some books. Our most recent book on dyslexia is Essentials of Dyslexia, 2024. It's the second edition.
Oh, I think I have an old one.
You've got the first one. Okay,
Yeah.
But now the second one, so expanded. And just recently this year, we came out with the tests of dyslexia, which I'm really excited about. It's been a 10-year project. And, just kind of thinking one day as I was doing a dyslexia evaluation is, why do I have to go to 3 or 4 tests to do a comprehensive dyslexia evaluation? I mean, why isn't it all in one place? I mean, so, I'm doing a little bit from here, a little bit from here, and there's all the problems with that, different norm samples, different kinds of scores, et cetera. So, just about 10 years ago, I started thinking, why don't we make a test that has it all in one place? Anyway, so COVID did slow us down a little bit, but we finally did release it this year, and pretty excited about it because it's also co-normed with rating scales. And so you can get information from parent, teachers, and the student too, to help support your quantitative data. So it really kind of makes it all fit together. So that's just been probably the most exciting recent thing we've been working on in terms of, dyslexia.
I'm actually very, very interested in the test of dyslexia. I saw it, I want to say the first time I heard it, I was at an IDA national convention last year or something like that, and there was a booth there talking about the assessment. It wasn't out yet. What areas does the test of dyslexia assess?
Well, essentially one of our first step was just to think about what all should be included in a comprehensive dyslexia, assessment. And so clearly, word reading, timed and untimed word reading, exception word reading, timed and untimed. And so pseudo word reading to get at phonics skills, and then exception word to get it more, orthography, timed and untimed. Spelling, of course. So within reading and writing, reading comprehension efficiency. So how well can you comprehend when you're being timed? And so there's quite a few reading and spelling tests, and oral reading fluency, several time tests to get at reading fluency. And then having several linguistic risk factors that often contribute to having dyslexia. And so good measures of phonological processing, orthographic processing, rapid naming, and, working memory. And so we really wanted to have a multiple deficit view of the linguistic risk factors, that contribute, to dyslexia. And so then we also included in there vocabulary and reasoning tests for several reasons. There are still a lot of states where they're using ability achievement discrepancy, for SLD identification. Also to rule out other, disabilities, have the reasoning in there for our English learners. And again, the vocabulary and reasoning to show that things that don't involve reading and writing, are average or above. And so that, that is included in, well, I think there's 26 tests total. And so you wouldn't need to give them all, but depending, on the referral concern. There's also a dyslexia diagnostic index that gives you a sense of the probability of dyslexia. Is it, it doesn't say they have it, but it says high probability or low probability that this is dyslexia. So, we're pretty excited about that. And, then I don't know if I mentioned we have rapid naming in there too. So several measures of that, as well. And just one other quick thing, but one thing we did kind of fun with the rapid naming tests, we made them confusable letters. So they're like B, P, D, Q, and so, even with adults with dyslexia, you'll see they're slower to respond when letters are confusable, like that. So anyway, a little twist in terms of a standard rapid naming, format.
This sounds like a really well-rounded evaluation system, and I really love that. And I wonder what kind of qualifications would somebody need in order to administer all of these assessments?
Basically, again, we're trying to make it available to academic language therapists, reading specialists, speech language therapists, school psychologists, and so we're trying to make it something that, a team could use maybe within a school. Someone decides somebody else gives a piece and somebody else gives a piece, but we're trying to make it available to people who have knowledge about dyslexia and reading. And so that's sort of a vast, group of professionals, really. So there's really not, one profession where you could say only those people. I mean, so diagnosticians in Texas, trying to make it available for people who do dyslexia evaluations.
Yeah.
Well, that is wonderful. So thank you for thinking of all of those different people, because honestly, as it sits right now, we're not qualified to administer assessments if you are not a diagnostician in Texas. But we can do screeners. We can evaluate, with the CTOP and the court, with the qualifications I have personally. But that's not enough information to tell a parent, quantitatively, okay, well, you got enough information to take back to a school to say, yes, we think that you have dyslexia, or it looks like you might have dyslexia, or the probability index like you're talking about. So the school doesn't have to even consider that, really, if they don't want to. So this is really excellent information to share with my parents or our listeners, to know that there is something out there that is available to us that we can use in the future.
And the Todd does have 3 screening tests that take about 10 minutes to give. And, so if you just did the screening tests and then the rating scales, you really have pretty rich, information about somebody's really has to dig deeper, into this.
So I think it's interesting. When I first heard about the Todd, I mistakenly had a misunderstanding about what a preponderance of evidence was. Right? Because we're in Texas, and so we've had Texas dyslexia law in place since 1985. And before I retired from public ed, our students were under Section 504 and most of them. Some of them were in special education receiving dyslexia therapy, and some were in special gen ed under Section 504 receiving dyslexia therapy. But my district that I had retired for, I was the dyslexia evaluator for Section 504. And so I would run through this district with my CTOP, my GORT, my TWS, my sometimes my C-Tony, sometimes the K-bit. I'm trying to think, the tower, all of those pieces.
The Woodcock Reading Master.
Yeah,
yes.
all the things I needed. And when I heard about the Todd, I was like, oh, I thought it was a preponderance of evidence. And my ship was righted. It was explained to me what that really meant. But could you explain to our audience, when we talk about a preponderance of evidence, what does that truly mean?
Well, I'm not really sure in terms of the Texas. What are they saying? How they're using that?
Well, the way it was explained to me is that a preponderance of evidence does not have to do with the multiple assessments that you're pulling in. It has to do with looking at student data and teacher data and parent data, and historical records and report cards and everything.
Okay, so it's just taking a broader lens, and not just standardized assessments, or looking at history, looking at family history as a family member with dyslexia, looking at early speech language services. I mean, so, teacher reports, self-reports, all that, really looking at everything, not just test scores. Because again, we all know that sometimes test scores don't really tell you what you need to know. I mean, they just don't sometimes,
It just tells you what's happening that day sometimes.
Exactly. And so sometimes there's, it's like you can, I can just think of a case of this, 5th grade girl where she scored average on the Todd screener. She has severe dyslexia, but she has been getting therapy since kindergarten, 1-to-1, 5 days a week. With Wilson Reading System and other, programs, she's doing quite well. Does she have dyslexia? Yes.
Yeah.
But it doesn't look like it on the test because she's got such good intervention. But really speaks to you of the power of early intervention when it's intensive and there's a highly trained reading teacher providing, the intervention.
Yes, it's been normalized is my understanding is what happened because of the intervention. Her scores have been normalized, but we still have to interpret in light of the intervention that's been provided.
Well, exactly. And everyone in her family has this, again, the preponderance of evidence. Everyone in her family has dyslexia. She's been in a special school for children with dyslexia, all those pieces. And the truth is, by the time she gets to high school, she's going to need the accommodation of extended time and for reading, in high stakes tests. And so, so that's good. Preponderance of evidence is smart.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
I think we all do that when we do evaluations too. You don't just look at your test scores.
Right.
You think of what's been done in the past, what kind of intervention have they had, all those pieces.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And sometimes school districts don't really look at that data.
Yeah.
And that's really a disservice to the child.
Yeah.
Yeah. So with all of your knowledge and your grand experience with developing all of these assessments and working so many years with children with dyslexia, I wondered if you could define dyslexia for us.
Basically, dyslexia is a problem in word reading accuracy and speed. Also affects spelling, okay? And so it really is a problem with basic reading skills and reading rate fluency and spelling. Now, if it's only spelling and not reading, it shifts into dysgraphia. But typically, again, individuals who struggle with reading also struggle, with spelling. So the main characteristics in terms of reading performance are trouble acquiring basic reading skills, phonics and sight words, and then after accuracy is established, trouble establishing fluency, trouble, building up an adequate rate, for reading. But so it's really, again, those kind of three main areas. And so most definitions, do, address that.
So I can remember going to, again, and I retired in 2021 after 30 years in public ed, and most of my career was dyslexia. And I can remember going to fairly recently a 504 meeting, and the principal had looked at me because I was the rep for the district, and she goes, "You're here again?" I was like, "Yeah, I'm here again for this meeting." And she's like, "I just feel like," I remember a principal saying, "I feel like dyslexia is the in vogue term right now." And I thought, in vogue term, is it in vogue to have dyslexia? She said it's just a recent development and it's going to go away over time. So what can you tell us about the history of dyslexia? Is it a recent development? Is it a flash in the pan?
No, we've, known about dyslexia for over 100 years or more. Now, early in the century, it was called word blindness. That you can't remember sight words essentially. And then the term word deafness, that you're having trouble, with speech sounds. And so documentation of individuals with reading disabilities goes back into the 1800s. And so we've really known about, dyslexia, for many, many years, and you will hear people say things like, "Oh, it's just whatever, made up term for, shouldn't use it, and it's like, there are people who haven't had experience with children who cannot learn to read easily, because once you have that experience, you realize dyslexia is real, and you realize how it affects children and a family, et cetera. But these people that say, dyslexia is just a made up label for lazy kids, it's like they just don't have the experience of having worked with individuals who struggle to learn to read. And so again, there's a really long history in terms of both assessment and intervention, for students who struggle, with reading. 1932, Monroe had a book, Children Who Cannot Read, where, she just talked about, these kids and, how they did so well in other areas, but they really struggled with reading. And she came up with a structured phonics approach to teach them how to read. And so, even in terms of intervention, it, goes back 100 years in terms of our understanding of dyslexia.
You had mentioned the family impact, and I've actually had families tell me they were so gracious of the help that they received because it impacted their whole family. They said this made everything so much better. They didn't have the crying and the fights and the not understanding what was going on with their child. It really opened up their eyes to help their child better. So I'm appreciative of all of the people like you and others who have led the way to help us identify dyslexia and know what it is, what to look for, and get the kids the help that they need. which leads me kind of to my question about, say somebody can't, some school district or people cannot get their hands on the test of dyslexia, which I hope that everybody can get that. But what bare bones should be included in an assessment of dyslexia?
Well, and again, I think this components, but the tot is not bare bones. The tot is big bones. Word reading, reading rate, spelling, the linguistic risk factors, phonological awareness, rapid naming, orthographic processing, working memory. And again, it just depends a little bit on the purpose, of the evaluation, as well, too. I mean, there's times, too, you want to dig into math because you realize they're struggling in mathematics as well, right? And so bare bones is reading, writing, spelling, and then linguistic risk factors. But again, there's cases too where you want to delve into oral language because it's, oral language as well as reading, oral language affecting reading, right? And so, as we all know, there's high comorbidity between dyslexia, and other disorders. And so, it can be kind of complicated.
So when you say linguistic factors, are you talking like students that are speech students with articulation or receptive language disorders, or what are you referring to with linguistics?
When I say linguistic risk factors, I'm not really referring to issues with oral language as much as the associated cognitive linguistic factors that can be low and contribute to dyslexia. So things like, phonological processing, which of course is part of language, rapid naming, processing speed, working memory. I mean, so, those kinds of abilities or skills or.
So I feel like when I'm training teachers, I tell them automaticity is the name of the game for everything that we're looking at with our students. They should be automatic in phonological processing. They should be automatic in decoding. They should be automatic, of course, in fluency, in spelling, because it shouldn't be a labored process. And if we're not teaching to mastery and, of course, automaticity, then we haven't done everything we should with that child for instruction. So what do you think of rapid naming as a standalone underlying cause of dyslexia? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, again, any of these linguistic risk factors would not be a standalone cause. And it's not so much rapid naming we've done that, but we've really looked at phonological awareness as the sole underlying cause, more so than rapid naming. But, it can be phonological awareness, it can be working memory, it can be RAN, it can be processing speed. I mean, there's many things it can be. So, some students have rapid naming problems and they tend to have fluency problems. Some kids have phonological awareness problems. They tend to have trouble with phonics, right? Some kids have working memory problems. They tend to have problems with everything, really. And so there's no one standalone factor. And that's, really why as a field, we have to start taking on a multiple deficit view of the factors that contribute to dyslexia and go beyond rapid naming, go beyond phonological awareness, and consider, other linguistic risk factors.
It is really an assessment because our students exist on a continuum. It's like putting a different puzzle together each time to get a clear understanding of who this student is. That's always how I felt. Anytime I went through an assessment, is that I just couldn't rely on what I had done in my past. It really is looking at each kid through a fresh set of eyes and understanding what they're doing.
Well, and I've had some of my colleagues think that rapid naming wasn't really something that would scream dyslexia to them because they had intact phonological awareness. So they thought, well, because their rapid naming was low, their spelling and the fluency was low. So, is it really dyslexia? This is kind of where my question came from. I've had different people question that as a diagnosis or an identification because of the fact that it was just rapid naming being the weakness.
You mean they're saying since it's just rapid naming, it's not a problem? Is that what they're saying?
Right. That is it really dyslexia because there's not the phonological awareness deficit?
Right. And there are individuals who have a rapid naming deficit, and that contributes to reading fluency problems, and so it's just as important, perhaps, as phonological awareness, and as much of a risk factor. And so if they have a rapid naming deficit, you definitely have to look at their reading speed, reading rate, et cetera. And so
that kind of goes back up to what you were talking about, that dyslexia is really difficulty with being able to acquire word reading and fluent reading, word reading, fluency, spelling, all of those things.
Right. And as you mentioned too, you've got to have this automaticity and ease with reading and writing. And that only comes with lots of practice and repetition, and therapy, really, in terms of the fluency automaticity is harder to establish than the accuracy. And so it just takes a lot of work. But unless you have that automaticity, you're still, struggling, and it's affecting, your expression, because, you're sitting there thinking when you're writing how to spell a word, not about what I'm trying to write. Right. And so we really want to try to get people, as you say, to this level of that it's automatic, fluent, and easy. But that's hard work. That's hard work getting
It is hard work, but that's what we're all here for, right?
It is. And which makes me think of a point that you were talking about. I think when children have dyslexia, it's really important that we tell them they have dyslexia. We explain to them what it is, how it affects them, how lots of people have it. It's not just them, how they'll work through it, how we're going to help them, how they are going to need to advocate for themselves and be able to tell the teacher, when you just say it, I can't get it down, but if you put it on the board, I could, so that they can actually start getting what they need, in terms of supports and things like that. But we want to take the mystery out of dyslexia. So the child understands it's not that I'm not trying, it's not that I'm lazy, and the parent understands that too. That's not it. Reading is hard for this person, and learning to read is very hard. And it's hard for teachers as well. And take the mystery out of it so everybody knows. And then they sort of grow into it and an understanding of why it's so hard for them.
Right. I love that. Thank you.
No, I have a shirt as a dyslexia advocate, and it says dyslexia, name it and claim it, because I think it's important that our kids, and we had said this on another podcast, that our kids understand that they're not the only ones in the group, kind of like what you were just saying now, that they're not the only ones, that there are others, and that you can be a successful person, with this dyslexia. But we're here to help them. We're here to help them.
Right. And then you can tell them too, you can thank your mom and dad for this.
That's what I was going to say.
Or Aunt Sandy or Uncle Tom.
Yeah. And I think a lot of my parents do that when they come out of the 504s and the R's. They're like, well, this is your side of the family.
Exactly. But I think we've all had the experience when we're talking to parents. One of them will say, that's just like me, or that's just like my dad, or that's like my brother. And so they really right away identify a family member who's had, might not have been identified, but has had similar struggles with reading and spelling, their whole life.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I know I can think of many meetings that I was in with parents who maybe they weren't identified, right? But they are listening to what the data is. They're listening to what they're hearing the diagnostician say, or me at the time do the assessments, what I saw during the assessment and how the student was struggling. And it's the mom or the dad or somebody will say, well, that's just like me. I do that too. And then they kind of realize, oh, So they were trying this whole time, and I tell people all the time, my hardest person to ever convince in an art or a 504 was always the father. Always the father when I present the data, because they're like, well, if they just worked harder. It's not a matter of working harder. It's they're doing what they can. They're doing all they can. Now we're going to step it up and provide the therapy that they need to be successful. So kind of leading into that discussion, let's discuss a little bit of heredity and dyslexia. There's definitely a link. What can you tell us about that?
Well, again, this has been something that's known for a long time. Dyslexia, runs in families. And, so if one parent has dyslexia, there's a 40% chance the child will have dyslexia.
Wow.
And so then if you have both parents that have dyslexia, some people say it's, almost 100%.
Wow.
But, it's really then very, very likely that the child, will have dyslexia. And so it definitely runs in families. And so one question we always want to ask when we're doing evaluations is, did anyone in your family struggle to learn to read and spell? And that's one of the first questions you want to ask, followed by, did your child have any early issues with speech and language? And so we want to ask that question too, because, just again, high comorbidity between language and, dyslexia. So dyslexia definitely runs in families. And as you just mentioned too, sometimes during the meeting, a family member will get a free diagnosis. They'll realize, oh, that was me. And they were never diagnosed, but you typically will find somebody in the family who's experienced similar problems learning to read and spell. And lots of times with adults too, you'll see they still have pretty significant spelling problems.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And a slow reading rate.
That was going to say fluency, text fluency, and written expression still is a struggle.
Yeah.
My husband likes to read stuff online all over the place, and he'll say, oh, this person is not very smart. They misspelled blah, 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 blah. I said, Michael, there are dyslexic people everywhere. Give them a break. They're probably dyslexic.
So kind of leading into that a little bit, you talked about comorbidities. I think we all know the ADHD one. What are some other comorbidities that could occur with dyslexia?
Okay, so first of all, with cases with dyslexia, 40% of individuals with dyslexia will have another disorder as well. And so it's very high. The three most common comorbid disorders, as you mentioned, are ADHD, developmental language disorder, and dyscalculia, math disorder. Okay. And so, those are the three, most common disorders. But then, we can also get into some of the self-esteem issues and anxiety and depression, and the impact in terms of self-esteem and behavior and things too. But those are the three most common comorbid conditions. And so, they complicate evaluations for people. It makes it more difficult when it's more than, just dyslexia.
Right.
Well, and that kind of leads me to the question about how does an ADHD child present in a testing environment, and how does that, along with a developmental language disorder, how would that impact a dyslexia evaluation?
And so with individuals, with ADHD, as I just mentioned, it complicates an evaluation, tremendously. And, I'm just thinking of an example I had where a mother brought me her 6-year-old son. She wanted to know if he had dyslexia. Well, he really had the worst ADHD I think I've ever seen in a child. I mean, he couldn't look at print. He couldn't, every time he answered a question, I had to put a sticker on his arm. And, it just was like, anyway, mom picks him up and says, well, does he have dyslexia? And I said, I don't have a clue. I said, I don't have a clue. I said, I can tell you he's going to have trouble learning to read, but right now it's because of attention. And until we can get him to pay attention and he can look at print, You can't tell if he has dyslexia or not. He can't look at print. His eyes just go all over the place. He'd been on Ritalin since he was 3.
Oh,
And it's still, crazy. But, anyway, so particularly with young children, it's really complicated in terms of figuring out, is this dyslexia? Is it ADHD? Is it, what is it? So it just really, complicates an evaluation. As they get older, it gets a little bit easier. Plus, you have more information, about school performance and stuff like that. But yeah, it's complicated.
And would like auditory processing also play a part into that complication as well?
Absolutely. And I kind of try myself to avoid that term just because it has so many different meanings to people. It has a meaning in terms of, speech language people, more in terms of understanding language. It has in intellectual theories, it has to do more with phonological processing. I mean, so
It's kind of a broad
yes,
term.
definitely, problems with language and sounds, speech sounds, affects, an evaluation, but that's a little more clear cut.
And now a word from our sponsor.
hi. This is Aimee Rodenroth, and as part of the Dyslexia Duo podcast team and owner of Discovery Dyslexia Services, I want to talk to you about my business. Our COUT-trained team offers expert virtual or in-person therapy located in Prosper, Texas, using proven dyslexia curricula like Take Flight, Build, MTA, Alphabetic Phonics, and Reading by Design. We also provide crucial independent evaluations and advocacy services. Don't wait. Empower your child today. Visit www.discovereed.com to learn more. That again is www.dyscoveread.com. Discovereed, covering all your dyslexia needs.
Hi, this is Melissa with Kids First Dyslexia Services. I am excited to share with you my private practice. Kids First Dyslexia Services is a private practice that specializes in dyslexia therapy. Each one-on-one session focuses on instruction specific to your child's needs in a nurturing environment that develops self-esteem, builds confidence, and fosters a sense of accomplishment, resulting in happier kids with higher levels of achievement. We provide a professional, personalized experience, always putting the child first. We value the relationships with both our students and parents, because strengthening skills and overcoming hurdles to achieve desired goals and success is a team effort. For more information, please visit www.kidsfirstdyslexia.com. That is www.kidsfirstdyslexia.com.
Let's return to the show. You had mentioned like early in your career that you worked with behavior students. Is that right? And that's how it led you to dyslexia research?
Uh-huh.
I tell people that I work with a lot, it's not unusual to see behaviors because they either withdraw or they act out because it's easier to be, and I'm doing air quotes, and I know people listening on a podcast can't see my air quotes, but it's easier to be the bad kid than to be the quote unquote dumb kid. They'd rather act out sometimes and avoid it. So how does dyslexia, in your experience, affect self-esteem?
Well, as you just mentioned, I think they either withdraw or act out. And so either one can happen. Well, a lot of the kids, they just withdraw. They won't ever volunteer to read. They don't ever hold up their hand. They try not to talk or interact, and they, tend to withdraw. I'm just thinking about one student who had, ADHD, but she was very sullen, and it was mostly just focus, not hyperactivity. But someone said to her, In order to get attention, you got to throw a book on the floor or something. You got to act out in order to get attention. So sometimes these kids who are withdrawn don't get attention because they're not causing problems. They're quiet, right?
Right.
But they're suffering, or then again, the kids, act out, as I say, by the time, with these middle school students, they were angry. They were angry and felt like school wasn't a place for them. Definitely, contributes to self-esteem. It's interesting. I remember looking at a study one time where it had adults with dyslexia list what their greatest problems were as adults, and the number one thing was self-esteem. And so still as adults, they, suffer from this feeling of inadequacy because they struggled with reading and struggled in school. And so it continues to affect people, even into adulthood.
Yeah, it's something you hold on to. I mean, you're impacted as a young child, and you can't shake it.
Yeah.
You can't shake that.
Talking a little bit, kind of switching gears to orthography. I've heard a lot of talks about orthography, orthographic mapping, orthographic processing, and I would like to break this down in a few steps just so everybody can kind of understand the progression of it. But what is orthography to you?
Okay. And this is something I've been interested in for the last 25 years or more. But, essentially, orthography is just the writing system of a language. And so it includes the spelling patterns, punctuation rules, capitalization. So it's all the rules, of the writing system. But, more specifically with dyslexia, sort of orthographic processing is sort of your brain's ability to recall these rules, remember patterns, remember spelling patterns, remember a pattern like IGHT, when you're spelling. And so the ability to sort of recall written words. And orthographic mapping is that process then of mapping the speech sounds, the phonemes, to the print. And so making the connection, like you see they have the word man, n, and then you map those phonemes to the graphemes. And with typically developing readers, when they've seen that whole word 1 to 4 times, it's automatized. They know it as a sight word. But with our kids with dyslexia, that can take a really long time. It can take a really long time. I mean, I can think of second grade students I've worked with, and, they're sounding out the word it. And you think, how many times have you seen that word and you still don't know it as a sight word? It's like, how many times, how is it going to take until that becomes automatized as a sight word? And so I think with a lot of our kids, it's really this orthographic mapping that's part of the big problem, that there's just not the retention then in as words as sight words. And so they're very slow to develop a sight word vocabulary.
If a child has dyslexia, do you think most of them have the difficulty with orthographic mapping?
Again, it's not all or most, or,
Okay.
some it's rapid naming, some it's working memory. So some some is phonological processing. And once they get work with speech sounds and understand that, in some cases, it's kind of resolved that issue. But lots of times what happens is it starts out as a phonological processing problem, but then you're left with an orthographic processing problem. They spell words just like they sound. They put the sounds in order. They're very good at that, but they're still not recalling in the spelling patterns. Still slow to build, sight words and things like that. But, I think with a lot of our students with dyslexia, this orthographic mapping is difficult. And that's why we see so many of the interventions focusing on helping kids with that process, and providing lots of practice, lots of repetition.
So the cards, the ARD cards, the IRD cards that we use in therapy are really to trigger that orthographic mapping. Is that correct?
Yeah, you map the speech sounds to the print. And so it's that process. And so, you think again, there's several steps involved in that. You've got to break apart the speech sounds, right? The first things you got to do, right? You got the speech sounds separate, then you got to map them to the letters and then blend it back together form a whole word, look at the word, and, again, then retain the word once you've seen it several times, hopefully.
So that's why, too, it's so important for them to say the sound, name the letter, write the letter, and then read the word afterwards, because that's just triggering that orthographic mapping. Is that correct?
Yeah, and just providing repetition, needed to master the letter, the sound, and providing that repetition.
I've heard about repetition for gifted learners, for traditional learners, for dyslexic learners. Have you, I'm sure you've heard it because you're the researcher and not me, but what are the repetitions involved for someone who's gifted and someone who's a traditional learner and someone who might be a dyslexic learner for learning a particular concept?
Well, that's an interesting question. Repetitions are necessary for any learner when the material is difficult for them.
Right.
And so I don't think it makes much of a difference whether gifted, traditional, dyslexic. It's just when material is difficult, it requires breaking it down in repetition. Okay.
Okay.
And so, that's just sort of a necessary step when you encounter material that's too difficult for you, to understand without help, essentially, right? But it's particularly critical with our students with dyslexia, just because many of them have problems with memory and attention, and so it becomes, probably, even more critical for those students with dyslexia.
So that kind of feeds into the automaticity piece that we were referring to. If it's not automatic and brought to the forefront at that moment, they won't be successful with what they're reading. They won't be successful with what they're spelling. Can you talk a little bit about reading and spelling and automaticity just a little bit more?
Well, just, again, having that ease in terms of reading words and spelling words is what frees up your cognitive resources to think, essentially, and reason. And you're not focused on basic skills. There's been a lot of research showing that establishing this automaticity takes time.
Thinking about all of that, the taking time and how difficult of a load that is for students with dyslexia to try to spell, knowing that they have to do so many different steps in order to commit this to their memory. If a student does have to take a spelling test, say in their classroom, what recommendations would you make to ensure success for them?
Okay, so if they have to take a spelling test, a couple suggestions I would make. One is to mark the number right, not the number wrong, and put a big plus by it, +5, not like -15. Okay. So big plus with a happy smiley face by it. It's better to have a spelling test that's a pattern. And so it's like, the IGHT family, and all those words are spelled with IGHT. So having a spelling test, that's a pattern. You can also, use words that they're misspelling in their writing that are common high frequency words and target, those as well. Students with dyslexia need, a different type of spelling instruction than kids who learn, to spell easily. You can make a modification. I'm thinking about Matthew, who was in 5th grade, and the teachers told Matthew, okay, I'm not going to give you 20 words on your spelling test. I'm going to give you 5 words, okay? And that's all we're going to grade. I'm going to give you 5 words to spell. He says, I want to take 20 words like everybody else. Kids don't like to be different. And she said, okay, you take all 20 like everybody else, but I'm just grading the first 5. That's what you're responsible for. So it's a private pact with the teacher and Matthew. He looks like everybody else. He takes the 20 words, right? And so just kind of remembering with accommodations, even older students, you don't like to feel different. You don't feel like I'm the only one in the room that has a whatever it is. Kids don't, like that. But I think one of the most effective ways working with kids with dyslexia with spelling, instead of doing a fixed spelling list where they have to memorize X amount of words on Friday, do a flow list. And with the flow list, what it is daily testing of like 3 words, 5 words, until they get it right 3 days in a row. Then you put it back in the box. You check it a week later. You see, do they still know it? If they don't, it goes back on the flow list again. If they do, it goes back in the box. And so again, just all that reinforcement, all that repetition and things, and, selecting words that they're misspelling in their writing. Or else the first step with spelling is you've got to be able to put sounds in order. So that's our first goal, put the sounds in order. But once they have the sounds in order, we have to start teaching them about spelling patterns.
Spelling is complicated.
Yeah, well, it is, but and again, I can think of so many kids with dyslexia just telling you how much they hate spelling because it's so hard for them. So I think, again, trying to make a spelling program that's very positive.
Yes.
Very positive. And that's why I say put a +5 and a happy face, It's like, good job. Spelling is really hard for these kids. And so don't make it punitive.
Right. I can remember a student that I know of that when she did her spelling test in class, she did okay, but the teacher took off for something that wasn't a spelling objective, numbering the words, and she put number in the parentheses around it, but she didn't put the period after the number. And so she took off every time there wasn't a period. I thought, that's not even a spelling objective. Why would you do something like that? So, yeah, making sure for sure that it's a spelling objective. So kind of jumping into irregular words and maybe even homophones. I can remember seeing some of my dyslexia therapy kids who would take the spelling test in the classroom, and then they show me their list and their irregular words for spelling. Or even homophones. My goodness, that's a hard one for them to differentiate. What would be some recommendations that you would make for at least spelling with irregular words or even homophones?
So the first thing with irregular words, we want to teach the student that not all the sounds are irregular. So let's look at this word and see what's irregular. So if we think about the word said, the S is regular, so is the D. It's just that AI in the middle. Okay, so we've got to highlight that AI, right? One kind of fun thing to do is put a big heart around it and say, this is the part you got to memorize by heart, or make it bright red, or make it bigger print or something, just to really draw attention with them. And then have them say the sound, the S sound, and then the letters AI, and then the D sound. You don't have to memorize S and the D. You just have to memorize that piece of this word. And so really, again, it's not all irregular. Every once in a while, you just have to give them some kind of mnemonic or something to help them. I remember Ben is in 5th grade. He's spelling would, W-U-D, should, S-U-D, S-H-U-D, right? Could, C-U-D. I said, okay, Ben, when you're writing those, just say, oh, you little dog. Oh, you little dog.
That's a good one.
He never spelled would, could, and should again, but you would see him then sitting there writing and going, oh, you little dog.
How cute.
My guess is he even still says that just to help him with those patterns. But, so sometimes you got to give them some kind of, mnemonic with the pattern just so they can, memorize it. But
I can see that relating to reading as well, like with the sight word said and putting a heart around the A and the I and just remembering that this is making a different sound. You're going to have to remember that when you see this word. I think that's a great strategy to use.
Yeah, we do something similar to that in my therapy sessions as well. And we even bring back in what's the initial sound that you hear. Okay, what letter do you use for that? And then we talk about the letter we would put down. So they are also tapping back into that phonological awareness as well. So a little bit about dyslexia and IDEA. Here in Texas, it's kind of new that we're under special education now. We were under 504. There was, of course, special education pathways as well, but we had kind of two different pathways where kids could be identified with a 504 pathway and under IDEA as well. Now we're identified under the same umbrella. So can you tell me a little bit about dyslexia and how it falls under the IDEA eligibility for a specific learning disability?
Right. And so dyslexia, as you know, there's, the 3 areas in reading, and, dyslexia would fit under basic reading skills, and then reading, fluency. If it's primarily a problem in reading comprehension, the cause is not poor decoding, that's not dyslexia. Okay. And so it would just be basic reading skills and reading fluency under IDEA that the student would qualify. But again, we've talked about, we've got kids that have developmental language disorder and dyslexia, and they have problems in both decoding and reading comprehension. Right. And so, in that case, it could also fall under reading comprehension when there's comorbid language disorders.
Okay, because in Texas, sometimes we have thought about the twice exceptional students and how sometimes they might not look like they qualify for dyslexia because they have above average abilities in other areas. So can you talk a little bit about that and how that might impact their identification?
Well, in terms of twice exceptional students, again, that can be complicated because many times these students have scores within the average range, but they're so bright, and average isn't good enough for these kids. And so, that's when we talk about looking at discrepancies between oral language, reasoning, and their reading writing ability. And so I think in those cases, like ability achievement discrepancies are pretty useful to show this person should be doing a lot better than they're doing. This student should be doing a lot better. And average isn't good enough for this student. This student should be a superior reader. It's complicated with those twice exceptional kids because sometimes their scores look like they're doing okay, but okay is really not good enough for these kids. They should be doing better.
Yeah, you're right. And I think that is a area for growth. And I know in our state, sometimes I've had students who they said, well, they don't really meet the criteria because they're showing that they're average and X, Y, and Z qualifying factors. But we talk about all the areas of which they're excelling. And we're saying, well, they're still having these issues that are characteristic of dyslexia. What is the cause if it's not dyslexia? So we've run into that, and I hope that that's an area of growth as we continue to spread the word.
And so many times these kids are identified in post-secondary, not, high school and things like that. They get to college, and all of a sudden the reading demands are so great, they're lost. They can't keep up, and they get an evaluation then. Well, you have dyslexia, And so sometimes, again, it's not diagnosed until you get to the point that there's just so much reading, you can't do it. You can't keep up. You can't read fast enough and things like that. But it is tricky with diagnosing these twice exceptional kids because, again, someone will say, well, they're doing fine. They're average, It's like, well, average isn't good enough for this student, But again, it's one of those complicating problems in terms of diagnosis.
It really takes people to put in the effort, the extra work, looking deeply at all of the information presented to them to get the appropriate diagnosis or identification.
Absolutely. Well, and again, adding in things like family history, other information, right? The preponderance of evidence,
Yes.
So adding that in.
So, we have, like I said, Texas Dyslexia and Law in place since 1985. We've had a handbook since 1986. I know states are in different states are in a state of flux about dyslexia. Really, there's different criteria that every state has for saying dyslexia, but and maybe this is me just not looking at it the right way. People seem to be okay with talking about autism and making autism identifications. But when it comes to dyslexia, we're not getting our kids identified like they should be or appropriately or providing appropriate services. Why do you think there are states that are still opposed to talking about dyslexia and providing that dyslexia label? I've heard from other states where they say, oh, we don't say dyslexia here. What do you say? How are they going to get the services they need? What are some of your thoughts on that?
Well, and again, you're very right. There are places where they say we don't use that term. They may say it's a medical diagnosis, which it was believed to be at one time, or, we don't say that. And, what happens is, well, he has a learning disability and basic reading skills. And then the parent will say, well, does that mean he has dyslexia? Because the parent has heard about dyslexia. So then they're like, well, what is this? I'm sure you're familiar with the 2015 memo from the Office of Education,
Yes.
where they said it's appropriate to use the terms dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia in IEPs, in evaluations, etc. So the government essentially said it's fine, it's appropriate to use these terms, in schools. But, it's interesting, there's still reluctance some places, to say the word. They've been kind of taught you can't say that. You can't say that.
Yeah.
And so, but I think change is starting to happen. And so I think there's more dyslexia awareness than there has been, and so I think that's starting, to change a bit. But just encouraging people to say, okay, if you have to say it's an IDEA category, it's a specific learning disability and basic reading skills, also known as dyslexia. And so just to clarify that, take the mystery out of it again. But if you're just thinking IDEA categories, dyslexia, falls under it, but it's not one of the categories. And so I think, again, if you're in a school that only talks IDEA categories, you may be reluctant, to say that.
You said it's yourself when we talked about the history of dyslexia. It's the late 1800s, early 1900s. They've had 100 or so years to kind of get with it and start talking about it a little more and start looking at our students. So, I hope change is coming. I really do. I really do.
I was also wondering, I get a lot of parents who come to me and they get the identification and they say to me, okay, so what do you recommend we do at home to help our child? And of course, I always recommend read to them. I feel like that's the best recommendation that I can provide at that time. But I also think it's important for them to look around and talk about vocabulary words, talk about what things mean, identify what's in their environment, and ask them questions about how their day was and things of that nature. What do you recommend for parents to develop their child's reading skills?
Well, it makes me think of a couple of things. It's important to keep reading being fun in the home. So the parent can read a paragraph and have the child follow along and then have the child read the paragraph back to them. So that's like a really good method for working, on reading. And maybe the parent even needs to read it twice before the child can read it. So if they want to do something like that, that can be very helpful. As you know, it's important for parents to get a really good reading tutor to work with their child. I don't recommend parents do that because it kind of changes the role and can create sort of anger and frustration between child and parent. Parent gets frustrated. Why can't you remember that? I just told you that, So getting, a really good reading tutor, there's some really good computer programs out there that parents can use at home with their child and, just have them do half an hour, 3 times a week or 5 days a week or something like that. So there's some really good programs that they can, access. Just trying to create a love for reading, in the home, finding some books that are of real high interest to the child and, just reading to them before they go to sleep and things like that. Some, story that, something that they're really interested in or something that the kids in their class are reading that they can't read on their own so they can talk to their friends about it. Oh, we were reading X and X last night and that was really neat, And so helping them feel included in what kids are reading in their classroom that are too hard for them to read independently. So
those are great tips. I have a son of my own. He's 24. And I have said to him recently, I was like, do you think I read to you enough? I don't know if I read to you enough. He goes, Mom, you read to me every night. I was like, okay, good. Phew.
That's funny. Yeah, we had to do the funny voices too.
Yeah.
But yeah, I can still hear Go Dog Go by our producer reading him to our daughter. He's over here laughing. So one of our other questions that we have is, if you could just grant any wish for our dyslexic students, or just our parents of dyslexia or whatever, but if you could grant any wish for our students with dyslexia, what would that be? What would Dr. Mather want to grant?
I'm thinking Lisa Kay, and she has a website called Dyslexia Inspired. It's sort of nice. I mean, she's got all kinds of sort of sayings to, help support people with dyslexia that are very, positive about dyslexia. But one of the things she says on one of her slides, she says, imagine a time when people with dyslexia can say they had a wonderful school experience with proper help, supports, and understanding of their unique strengths and learning needs. So that's what I would hope. We get to the point that all children with dyslexia feel like they had a wonderful school experience. And we know that's possible. You look at some of these private schools for kids with dyslexia, these kids are thriving. They're having fun. They love school. And so it's very, very possible. So I would just hope that we try to create a climate in our school where all children have a positive, wonderful experience and love going to school and love learning. That's what I would hope.
I think that's great. I do have one question. So in one of our other podcasts, we had asked our guest speaker what books she recommended. And I thought it was just kind of a one-off question, but I had somebody reach out to me and say, oh my gosh, I love when you talk about books and resources because I want to add to mine. So what books do you have that you would recommend to parents or teachers or whatever about dyslexia? Or what books do you recommend?
Depends a little bit about how deep a dive a parent wants to take in dyslexia. Jan Hasbrook has a nice book, Conquering Dyslexia. Sally Shaywitz's book, Overcoming Dyslexia, but you're taking a pretty deep dive in that one.
Yeah.
So it just depends a little bit on, how much you want to learn about. But, the truth is, the more a parent knows about dyslexia, the better advocate they can be for their child. And so, pretty soon, people realize this parent knows probably more about dyslexia than anyone in the school, perhaps. And so I think arming yourself with knowledge about dyslexia really pays off in terms of being able to advocate for your child and make sure they get the supports that they need and the understanding, that they need. And, also, I think being able to pick teachers for children with dyslexia. So not just they get whoever, but it's important we really pick teachers because there's teachers who have good understanding, empathy, and they're great with these kids. And then there are others teachers that just not so many, but they don't have much of an understanding. They think the child's being lazy. They don't know how to teach them. They're frustrated. And not so many of those. But children with dyslexia can't afford a year in a classroom with a teacher who doesn't understand them.
Right.
And support
Absolutely.
them. They can't afford that. That's when the real self-esteem stuff starts. And so making sure we get the right teacher, each year, for our children, because, that just makes a huge difference.
And proper accommodations.
Yeah.
I know we didn't really talk about accommodations very much, and I didn't know if you feel like you want to touch on that topic really quickly, but accommodations in the classroom are vital to a child's success. Do you have any that you feel like would be most helpful to helping these kids?
Well, obviously in terms of accommodations with students with dyslexia, the most critical one is getting more time or shorter assignments, so you'll talk to some of these kids with dyslexia and, they spent 2.5 hours on their homework where another student spent a half an hour, right? Just saying things like, I want you to read tonight for 30 minutes. And so that makes it, you read 15 pages, great. You read 75 pages, great. But, and so trying to set things up so that's equitable in terms of the amount of time kids spend and the amount of energy. And as students age in school too, having extended time on exams is critical so that they can really demonstrate what they know and they get to see all the questions, rather than how fast they can read, And so we really have to take the pressure off in terms of these timed exams where, a student with dyslexia will say, I got halfway through and the time was up, and I never even saw the last 30 questions, and then they just start guessing on things anyway. So with older students, extended time is, critical. And then just modifications that ensure that the child can be successful. And that's going to vary from individual student to individual student. What's it going to take for the student to be successful in my spelling program, in my reading program? What's it going to take to make them successful, right?
Absolutely.
That takes a really good team approach with the parent and the teacher, prior teachers if necessary, everybody having a weigh in on that.
Absolutely. Well, I think, is that all we have? That went by really fast. Wow. Okay.
Time flies when you're having fun and learning a lot.
Oh my gosh, you should see our
notes.
So many notes, so little time. Well, Dr. Mather, I keep trying to make you plural. I keep calling you Dr. Mathers when I'm talking to somebody. I'm like, no, she's singular. Dr. Mather, I appreciate that you came on our podcast today. You are just, like I said, you have some of the greatest presentations that I've seen when I've seen you at IDA or even, I think, Altum, maybe some years ago. And I was just so excited that you said you could come on the show. Thank you for taking time out of your busy weekend to record this session with us.
Been delightful to be here with you. And IDA is in Dallas next year.
I know. We're going to be there. The Dyslexia Duo is going to be there.
I just heard I got accepted, so come see me.
Yes, we will.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're going to be there recording a podcast live.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Great.
So you come see us too.
Okay, for sure.
Thank you so much for your time. I love doing assessments. I actually would like to go that pathway and do diagnostician work, but I'm scared of the statistics because I'm horrible at math. I think I have dyscalculia on myself. Never been diagnosed, but I do believe I have that. Anyway, I love the assessment piece. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, and I appreciate all of your time.
Okay, well, great. Thank you.
The Dyslexia Duo hosts are Melissa Dean
and Aimee Rodenroth. The producer is Greg Rodenroth.
Dyslexia awareness is so important. Please share with your friends, family, and anyone who needs to know more about dyslexia.
Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and X at The Dyslexia Duo.
Thanks for listening.
Bye.